Hello and welcome to The World as We See It. My name is Lloyd Hobart Mitchell and I'm an ordinand with the St George's congregation here in Pattaya in Thailand, and my formation is being overseen in context by Father David Price. Now, David Price is actually the person who plays the organ, not just at our Sunday church services, but also the introductory music for our Twitch stream here. So he's actually a very well-known organ player in the UK and is used to doing recital tours across the UK during the summertime. Now, I also should mention Father Tom. Father Tom, I usually meet with him on a Tuesday. I didn't today. We had no internet, which was very annoying. But I normally meet with him on a Tuesday, and we go over what we've read in Paul Tillich's systematic theology. And so that pretty much describes the who we are, and the who I am, and the context of where I am, and everything like that. Now, tonight's stream was a bit hit and miss. It was going to be, almost unlikely that I would do it because we had no internet earlier on, and trying to deal with the local 3BB folk. Was a bit of a nightmare. They were unable to tell me when it was going to be repaired. They've known for since yesterday, and when we spoke to them this morning, we said, is it going to be repaired today? Or probably not. Is it going to be repaired tomorrow? Sure. And I don't know why, but I'm not always confident when people say sure to me. Very often it actually makes me feel more nervous. Anyway, we were waiting. We assumed that it wouldn't work, and I was going to have to hotspot the telephone or the mobile phone or whatever, and get it going. Anyway, I came upstairs, just planning to do just that, to hotspot the mobile phone, and it worked. The internet was on. So they've done something without telling us, and not a bad thing. They've done a good thing without telling us. So I was very, very happy about that. Father David Price has just checked in with a like, which is very, very good. And the plan today is to now we are live and we're online, and that's all good and it's working. The plan today is to go over the Church Times headlines, as we do a couple of times a week. Then after that, we're going to go on with the three books which we are reading at the moment, I think that's not a bad plan. Yeah. Now let me just get us over to the Church Times. Had a very, very difficult weekend here. Our house in particular. But despite that kind of maelstrom of stress, of storm, actually we've got a bit of good news, and I don't mind sharing it. I think I've mentioned before that our little boy doesn't speak too often. He doesn't say very much. He's 4.5 years old, and he's obviously, in terms of developmental stages or whatever, I don't really know the phrases we use. These benchmarks that children are set against. He can say nouns, so he can say dog and horse and cat and things, but he doesn't really say "I want" or any kind of phrases or sentences, and it was becoming a bit of a concern. But over the weekend, despite having a pretty stressful weekend, actually we've seen some light at the end of the tunnel now. So there's a very nice little school down the road from us, and they've we met with the chap yesterday who oversees it, and it's connected to the Father Ray Foundation. So Father Ray has an orphanage here in Patia, and they have a school which, as part of that, there is a teacher who specialises in speech. And what they were saying is that our little boy could go there for maybe 6 months or a year to bring him up to a standard. I don't know what standard that is, but a standard. And then, more than likely, he will be able to go to standard school down the road. So that for us is a huge weight off our shoulders. Instead of thinking, what are we going to do, and struggling, actually knowing that we're going to have a bit of support. That was really good news. So I thought I'd share that. Anyway, now let's get back to where we were, and we were looking at the Church Times. So the biggest headline is the 14 folk arrested in St Paul's Cathedral. Oh, and we've got, and I don't know who you are, but 544H4H5 has followed us, so that's wonderful. So thank you very much for the follow. That's great news. Yes, very, very, very good news. Of course, if I'm talking about something and you feel like commenting, and there's Khalid as well. Khalid's given us a like on Facebook. Now, if you fancy commenting on anything we're talking about, if you fancy engaging with anything I'm saying, you're very, very welcome. We don't have very many comments, and so that would be great if you could. Now, let's get back to the Church Times. And 14 people arrested in St Paul's Cathedral after a fossil fuels protest. Now, these are the Christians who are protesting against the Church of England's investments in fossil fuels, and also encouraging the Church of England to move away from using fossil fuels. And I mean, I feel very strongly about this. I really do. We have a group. I think it may well be in the ticker that goes along the top of the screen there. But we have a group, and the group is called Eco-Active Christians. Okay, and you're very welcome to join the Facebook group Eco-Active Christians if you share the concerns of those who were protesting in St Paul's Cathedral. Or if you share my concerns. Oh, we've got a few people watching on Facebook today. So Robert Watson and Hunter Adams and Alberto Mellis. And Terry as well. So good to see you all. Now, my major concern with the climate change thing, and I'm sure I'm not alone, is I really see it as the greatest existential threat to the human species, to mankind, to humankind. Um, and I appreciate, I understand that there's lots of money invested in all of these things which pollute the earth. And pretty much, if we're going to say it in simple terms, money is the reason why not a lot of or not sufficient action has been taken over the years. We've known about, or scientists and governments have known about, the greenhouse effect, as it used to be called, since before 1900. So we've known about it for more than 100 years. We've been monitoring it happening for more than 100 years. And obviously it picked up a pace, and it's become a lot more urgent, and more recently it's become a crisis because by now weather patterns are being affected, and it doesn't. I'm not getting drawn into the cause. I think it's an irrelevant argument. Who caused it? Is it something caused by man, or is it a natural phenomenon? We know that pollution exacerbates it. We know that fossil fuels exacerbate it, irrespective of whether there are natural weather fluctuations. Our actions make it worse. The science backs it up. We can see it. Now, more recently, people and communities are being affected by it. Those poor folk on the Solomon Islands, as the sea levels rise, and the Solomon Islands, where people have lived for millennia, their little island homes are sinking. They're disappearing. They're not sinking at all, actually. The water's just rising. So their islands get smaller and smaller and increasingly underwater. And it's not just the Solomon Islands. There are a whole bunch of islands spread across the Pacific where communities are going to have to be moved. These are going to be climate refugees. So, and I think this is the beginning of, there will be lots of climate refugees. So what a very nightmarish position. Well, look, in St Paul's Cathedral in England, 14 people were arrested as they attempted to, or they did unfurl a banner, and lots of them were arrested. And I think it's an interesting thing that climate change is one of those things where it is abhorrent. It's morally abhorrent, and it's something where those of us, and I count myself amongst them, who see it as immoral and should be criminalized, right? If you're making the planet's, if you're making our situation worse, then it should be criminal. But in truth, the witnesses of these acts, which exacerbate our climate crisis, the witnesses, in this case 14 people stood in St Paul's Cathedral who unfurled a banner, they're the ones being arrested. The perpetrators who make the planet's situation worse, or even worse than that, just simply profiteering from the businesses which pollute our world, they're allowed to carry on. They're not prosecuted, they're not arrested. So I do think it's a very urgent situation, and the whole thing's a bit topsy-turvy the way it's being dealt with. I think that instead of words, it's an emergency, it's a crisis, everyone needs to do their bit and do it very urgently. So I'm afraid I'm with the protesters on that one. Now, that might be controversial. I don't know if it is controversial. Oh, hello, Elizabeth. I can see you've joined us on Facebook too. Now, let's have a look at the next one. Charities urge support for threatened Afghan Christians. I mean, if it's only now, the 28th of August, that people are coming out to say, what about the Afghan Christians? weren't they part of the government's plan? Weren't they part of the US and Britain and any other allies' exit strategy? Aren't they obviously a vulnerable community? My understanding is that there are something like 800 Afghan Christians. It's not a huge community. Why couldn't they have been, and I'm not saying uppermost, of course, don't get me wrong. We have to look at all of those interpreters who assisted the army, irrespective of faith. But when I read about a British man who was supporting the stray dogs out there, has been airlifted with a bunch of his animals, I do then think that the priorities were a bit wrong if those 800 Christians were not prioritised. I think that's and simply because of their faith, because of course they're going to be targeted anyway. So Afghanistan tends to take a lot of the pages. We've got Australia's going to take 20,000 Afghan refugees. I think that was a while ago that one was confirmed, wasn't it? An annual report shows a decline in British children's happiness over the past decade. This is an interesting one because I remember my grandmother talking about happiness. She was born in 1921, my grandmother. And she would talk about pretty much the slums of the East End, right, of London, and her stories didn't sound very nice very often, but she spoke about how happy people were, and I remember all of her stories, whether she was talking about running round to see her grandmother, or popping round to see Aunt Et, or going round to see her cousin, this person, cousin Vi, or loads of them, right? A huge clan in the East End of London. And after the Second World War, everyone was given, and rightly so, instead of living in unsuitable accommodation in a blitzed out, bombed out London, they were given accommodation out in Essex, in Dagenham and Basildon and places like that. Whereas our part of the family had been given an exchange to Kent. And we lived in Bromley. I grew up in Bromley in Kent, which is actually not in Kent at all. It's a London borough, changed in the 1970s. But nevertheless, we always say Bromley, Kent, because it used to be part of Kent. Now, that, I think, for lots of folk, was the beginning of the end, because families were broken up, they were split up, families moved further afield. Now, in as much as that's happened over the last 70 years, I suppose, more and more families moved further and further and further away from their own families, because of work, because of circumstance, whatever. I think the strange thing is that I think this COVID pandemic and our use of FaceTime or Skype or Zoom or WhatsApp video calls or whatever the platform we're using, I can't help but think that actually over the last 18 months I've actually seen my family more, despite living here in Thailand. I've seen them more than I've seen them in the last 10 years, for the 10 years prior. So the lockdowns means people had more time, they had more time to speak to their families, and there were more opportunities in terms of technology to see your family, to show them your little boy, to show them toys that he was playing with, whatever, bits of artwork that he scribbled on the paper. So, yes, although I agree with that, over the past decade, maybe children have become less happy. I do think the flip side of the very recent pandemic that we're, here in Thailand, we're still living in it. There's no easing of things really. I mean, there's a little bit of it. On Saturday, we're going to have 25 people in church, not just 5. But it is still capped at 25. And I only heard yesterday that the number of deaths in our little province here, 5 people had died from COVID. So the deaths are still, going on. I know it's only, don't get me wrong, don't lock everything down because 5 people have died when you might have had 200 people dying in motorbike crashes because they didn't wear helmets. So things need to be looked at in, relative to everything else. But I do think that this technology that we've all been able to use to speak to our friends, our loved ones, it's certainly made me happier, and it means that my cousins and aunties and things have been able to have a bit more of a relationship with my boy. So yeah, that was good. Anyway, so that's a thought, food for thought. Let's get back. We're going to rush down through the rest of the so UK churches aid refugees from Kimball. Well, I think that makes sense. If there are refugees moving into a community, it makes absolute sense that churches in those communities should rally, and the local churches together organisations should have a strategy for dealing with them. So that's my opinion. Let's have a look. We've got that one there. Churches aid refugees. If you want to, we've done that. We did that on Friday. There hasn't been a huge amount updated since Friday. So I think what we're going to do is we'll go instead for the John Pritchard book. And we've got the John Pritchard book, which is here. And the John Pritchard book is The Life and Work of a Priest. It looks a bit like that, and you should be able to see that. What I'm going to do, I've got these miniature pegs. I don't know if you know what I mean when I say a little mini peg. Literally, it's a mini peg. Okay? And I'm using that to keep the book open because I've created. I mean, it looks a little bit like a Blue Peter project, so if that makes sense to anyone there. So I've created a little book stand here, so I should be able to read by looking down without showing you the top of my head the whole time, which I think might be a bit of an improvement on the stream. So we've read about young people being the imperative, and that was good. We're next having a look at the cultural imperative, and we are in the chapter called the multilingual interpreter. Okay? So, the cultural imperative. A young research scientist with an engaging personality and an open mind went through a Christian basics course with interest and commitment. At the end, however, he said with some regret that he couldn't embrace the Christian faith because the world simply isn't like that. He clearly had a spiritual side to his nature. He was no reductionist. But the way that Christianity configures the world was simply not credible to him. This is the kind of response that sends a chill down the spine of the priest. It illustrates the distance that our culture has drifted away from its Christian roots, or the inability of the church to speak in a language the ordinary, intelligent person grasps. Too many good, thoughtful people, to too many thoughtful people, Christianity just doesn't make sense. It isn't a matter for blame or sorrow. but it needs to be taken with the utmost seriousness. Social scientists talk about a paradigm shift in our whole Western world view, our values, structures, and institutions. In a few short generations, there's a new world, such that people born now cannot even imagine the world into which their grandparents were born. This new post-modern landscape has been too well documented to need rehearsing here, but the implications for the church and the role of the priest are profound. The church is caught up in this deep structural shift. No priest can afford to keep doing the same thing in the same way as they were doing in the 1970s. We have a culture where all meta-narratives are suspected of being power plays, where you make your own choices and construct your own reality, where you channel hop and surf the net to engage with the surface contours of our culture, but you move on before getting too deep. This last characteristic is particularly confusing to traditional forms of church, where the potent images are of depth and foundation rather than surface and speed. The danger is that Christians could become cultural exiles in a society where we now find bookshops placing the Bible in the section marked esoteric. And this in a culture shaped at its deepest level by the Christian faith. When faced with this relentless suspicion, antagonism, and apathy to the faith that they hold dear, it's important for priests not to lose their nerve. One of our fundamental theological convictions is that men and women are made in the image of God, are endlessly loved by Him, and will find their fulfillment supremely in Him. No matter what they think of Jesus, Jesus thinks that they are worth His life. And the priest is an agent of this inexhaustible love. Confident in that truth, the priest goes out to engage with the prevailing culture thoughtfully and gracefully, and on issues of real and lasting concern. Broadly, these will be pre-modern questions to do with meaning and purpose, modern questions to do with truth and reality, and postmodern questions to do with the practical living and lifestyle. The pre-modern questions don't change. They may be differently framed today, but questions about the meaning of meaninglessness of life, and about the origin and destiny of the universe, and of us within it, are always being asked. Priests need to have a clear theological map so that they can move around the various grid points in order to offer cogent, faith-based interpretations. This means continuing our theological reading rather than letting our theology be a hardened deposit of truth that becomes more and more inaccessible and further away the further away we get from our original training. It also means being able to make our explanations in both Daily Mirror and Guardian language, depending on the need. Modern questions about truth shouldn't be ignored just because they are out of favour. The problem otherwise is that people will assume that these issues have simply been resolved and not in God's favour, it will be assumed that agnosticism is the obvious mark of a sound, rational, and a healthy mind. That Jesus couldn't possibly be more than another good prophet. That science and religion are in permanent conflict, and that religion is at the root of most of the world's problems. And if there's still any doubt, suffering is the final proof, either that God doesn't exist or that he's culpably negligent. The priest needs to be able to make credible responses to these assumptions, which are all the more insidious for being taken as given. We need to be prepared to say as often as necessary, actually, I'd like to go back and revisit the assumptions I think are being made here. Postmodern questions about the practicalities of living, making choices, and living well make up another whole raft of issues for the priest to be engaged with. This is where ethical issues come to the fore, and where the current fascination with spirituality is an important, if frustrating, arena of dialogue. Spirituality is clearly very popular today. It usually seems to have a somewhat Eastern flavour and is associated with wisdom, experience, mysticism, and self-help. Spirituality is contrasted favourably with religion in a clear standoff. Spirituality is seen to be more about freedom and religion more about control. Spirituality is open and religion is narrow-minded. Spirituality is accepting and religion is judgmental. The priest has to understand the depth of this dichotomy in order to face it seriously, while also recognizing that people's fascination with spirituality may be a hunger for the holy, which Christian faith is well able to address if offered sensitively and intelligently. So I think that's enough today from John Pritchard. I like his book. I'm glad we're getting onto this notion, and you might remember a couple of weeks ago Father David Price's homily where he spoke about the world of spirituality and folk having no conviction to one thing or another. They're just spiritual without conviction. So yes, very interesting, very valid, and it's interesting to see that John Pritchard and Father David Price, what they're saying is resonating with each other. Very good. Now, we've got two people watching on Facebook. We've got Rick Tate is watching. Welcome, Rick. And we've got somebody else whose name is written in the Thai language, but I'm afraid I can't read it. So forgive me for not being able to read your name. It's written in the Thai language, and I'm afraid I can't read Thai. But you're very welcome indeed. So we are going over now to have a look at the Dan Kimball book, How Not to Read the Bible. Okay, and we are going to be starting with, and there's a fair amount, it's worth saying, in this How Not to Read the Bible. I don't think it's meant to be read in one go, because it's not a particularly big book, but I think it's meant to be picked up and read, and you read a bit and have a think about it, and then pick it up and read the next bit. And there's a little bit reiterated from the last bit you've read, and that seems to happen in every section, so there's a fair amount of repetition. Now, we're starting in the section which is called Never Read a Bible Verse, and we are looking at the heading, Every Bible Verse is Part of a Bigger Story. So, as we learned earlier, the Bible is a library of 66 books written over a 1,500 year time period. by more than 40 authors from different cultures who wrote in 3 languages using all types of genres. Yet it tells a unified story. That story has a beginning and an end, with all types of plot twists and characters entering and leaving the story. With the success of the film version several years ago, most people today are familiar with the basic storyline of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Millions have seen the movies or read the books. If you were to open the 3rd book in the trilogy, Return of the King, you might read about Gollum and his intense desire for the ring worn by Frodo. His desire was so intense, he eventually bites off Frodo's finger to get it before falling into the fiery lava of Mount Doom. But if you are beginning your reading in the 3rd book of the whole story, you're missing the backstory. You don't know Gollum's origins, where he came from, and his relationship with the ring. And you won't understand why he is acting this way. You miss what is significant about the ring's power and why, for most of the 3rd book, Frodo is wearing the ring around his neck, not on his finger. Many details of the plot and the actions of the characters would be confusing if you opened a novel or started watching a movie without starting at the beginning. And it's true. I mean, I'm not reading. I stop now for a moment. It's true. I always think that the first 10 minutes of a movie are the most important because it tells you almost everything in terms of character, setting, plot. We know what the movie's about in the first 10 minutes. Because they want to grip us in the first 10 minutes. The incredible Hollywood filmmakers, they know that if they've got us in the first 10 minutes, then we're probably going to watch the whole movie. And it's quite true, isn't it? So if you went into the middle of a movie, you don't know who the characters are, you don't know where it's set, and you haven't got a clue what the plot is. True. Now, let's carry on. Jesus has a backstory called the Old Testament. When you read about Jesus in the Bible, you need to understand that Jesus doesn't just appear one day out of nowhere. He has a backstory that begins long before his birth in Bethlehem. There are hints of him in the book of Genesis, as far back as the Garden of Eden, and in a promise made about him to Abraham. The hints about Jesus become more clear in the writings of the prophet Isaiah, leading right up to his birth in the New Testament. There is an entire story that precedes his birth, giving all that he says and does additional meaning. We need the Old Testament to understand the New. The Old Testament was written to specific people groups in specific time periods for specific reasons. Many of the laws we read in the Old Testament no longer directly apply to us because they were made under the Old Covenant, an agreement that outlined how certain people related to God at that time. Today, those who are Christians belong to the New Covenant, made possible through Jesus. This doesn't mean the Old Testament is useless or unimportant. As we've seen, we need to know the full story because it points us to the significance of Jesus and the New Testament he established. Without knowledge of the Old Testament, we miss the breadth and depth of the New Testament. And more importantly, we miss knowing the fullness of God through his work of creating and relating to people throughout the ages. Much of the confusion over a single Bible verse comes from looking at that verse or story without knowing the full story. No single chart or graphic can capture the full complexity and beauty of the Bible storyline. But I've found that one image, 3.2, is helpful. We'll come back to it throughout the rest of this book. So take a moment to look it over and familiarise yourself with it. Now what I will do is I will get this graphic and I will add it to our Twitch stream, and then whenever we refer to it from now on, we'll show the graphic, and then you guys, wherever you are, can see what he's talking about. Okay? Now, I think that's as far as we're going to go. All right? I think that's enough of how not to read the Bible. And I'll get hold of that graphic for us for tomorrow. And we will start tomorrow on page 44, where it says the storyline of the Bible comes in 6 acts. Okay. Now, that brings us then to, well, it's not really the final act. The final act really is the collect, we say. But in this case, it is the final act of book reading. The final act, which is Tillich. And Tillich's book, which is called Systematic Theology. Now, of the 427 pages, we are on page 186. And we are in the chapter which is called Being and the Question of God. And we're on part C, which is called Being and Finitude. Okay, and it actually starts with a number 6, being and non-being. So the question of being is produced by the shock of non-being. Only man can ask the ontological question, because he alone is able to look beyond the limits of his own being and of every other being, looked at from the standpoint of possible non-being. Being is a mystery. Man is able to take this standpoint because he is free to transcend every given reality. He is not bound to beingness. He can envisage nothingness. He can ask the ontological question. In doing so, however, he also must ask a question about that which creates the mystery of being. He must consider the mystery of non-being. Both questions have been joined together since the beginning of human thought. First in mythological, then in cosmogonic. Now, cosmogonic, I'm afraid we're going to have to look that word up. I've not come across the word cosmogonic before. And so let's have a look and see. I don't mind doing this. I was actually chatting to Father David about this the other day. That I'm very, very happy. Oops. Why? I try to share that. And it's not showing you that. Why not? There we are. There we are. That's better. So, cosmology is a branch of astronomy that involves the origin and evolution of the universe from the Big Bang, which, by the way, I don't know if you remember this, but the Big Bang theory was actually created by a Catholic priest who was an astronomer. So there's and the whole, the theory was something which was developed within the church by this Catholic priest, who then took it to his stargazing peers And they laughed at him about his theory and said, "What do you mean? Some sort of Big Bang?" And he was like, "Yeah, precisely that." And then they looked at the evidence he'd come up with and said, "Yeah, it actually looks quite right. Yeah, probably a Big Bang." And so that was the Big Bang theory. So there's, sorry, I don't know why we've gone back to there. We need to come back to here. Welcome back. Now, so here we said, so cosmogonic, and finally in philosophical terms, the way in which the early Greek philosophers, above all, Parmenides, wrestled with the question of non-being is most impressive. Parmenides realized that in speaking of non-being, one gives it some kind of being which contradicts its character as the negation of being. Therefore, he excluded it from rational thought. But in doing so, he rendered the world of becoming unintelligible and evoked the atomistic solution, which identifies non-being with empty space, thus again giving it some kind of being. What kind of being must we attribute the non-being? This question never has ceased to fascinate and to exasperate the philosophical mind. There are two possible ways of trying to avoid the question of non-being. The one logical and the other ontological. One can ask whether non-being is anything more than the content of a logical judgment. A judgment in which a possible or real assertion is denied. One can assert that non-being is a negative judgment devoid of ontological significance. To this, we must reply that every logical structure which is more than merely a play with possible relations is rooted in an ontological structure. The very fact of logical denial presupposes a type of being which can transcend the immediately given situation by means of expectations which may be disappointed. An anticipated event does not occur. This means that the judgment concerning the situation has been mistaken. The necessary conditions for the occurrence of the expected event have been non-existent. Thus, disappointed expectation creates the distinction between being and non-being. But how is such an expectation possible in the first place? What is the structure of this being which is able to transcend the given situation and to fall into error? The answer is that man, who is this being, must be separated from his being in a way which enables him to look at it as something strange and questionable. And such a separation is actual because man participates not only in being but also in non-being. Therefore, the very structure which makes negative judgments possible proves the ontological character of non-being. Unless man participates in non-being, no negative judgments are possible. In fact, no judgments of any kind are possible. The mystery of non-being cannot be solved by transforming it into a type of logical judgment. The ontological attempt to avoid the mystery of non-being follows the strategy of trying to deprive it of its dialectical character. If being and nothingness are placed in absolute contrast, non-being is excluded from being in every respect. Everything is excluded except being itself, i.e., the whole world is excluded. There can be no world unless there is a dialectical participation of non-being in being. This is not by chance that historically, the recent rediscovery of the ontological question has been guided by pre-Socratic philosophy, and that systematically there has been an overwhelming emphasis on the problem of non-being. The mystery of non-being demands a dialectical approach. The genius of the Greek language has proved a possibility of distinguishing the dialectical concept of non-being from the non-dialectical by calling the first me on and the second ukon. Uk on in the nothing, which has no relation at all to being. Me on is the nothing, which has a dialectical relation to being. The Platonic school identified me on with that which does not yet have being, but which can become being if it is united with essences or ideas. The mystery of non-being was not, however, removed, for in spite of its nothingness, non-being was credited with having the power of resisting a complete union with the ideas. The me-ontic matter of Platonism represents the dualistic element which underlies all paganism and which is the ultimate ground of the tragic interpretation of life. Now, I think that's enough of Tillich. I'm sure when I say that, there are some people who say, yes. I don't mean it in a bad way. I think that Tillich was a very clever guy, but I can't help but think if I carry on reading, I won't be able to percolate the words I've already read. I think my brain will overflow with words, and then it will be no use. We need this to be useful and beneficial. So we're going to stop there. We're going to carry on where it says Christianity has rejected, and that's where we are, and we'll come back to that tomorrow. Look, so good. Now, hopefully you've seen a bit of a difference in terms of the reading. I feel like I was reading something down here, not reading something down here. So that's a little bit of a difference, and I hope that I don't know, was better. What we're going to do now is pop over to where we go to every evening, which is the daily prayer of the Church of England. So the daily prayer website, in fact, there's the Church Times link. I don't know why I didn't send that out earlier on. There's the link to where we get our evening collect. And we'll go there now. Visit, we beseech thee, O Lord, this place, and drive from it all the snares of the enemy. Let thy holy angels dwell herein to preserve us in peace, and may thy blessing be upon us evermore. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So, thank you for sticking around. Thank you for visiting us. If you've watched us on Facebook or YouTube, then I will obviously endeavour to get you to come over to Twitch to see us. And you can find us on Twitch. It's called The World as We See It. Thank you again, and I will see you hopefully tomorrow at the same time. Without further ado, I will say to you, with prayers and best wishes,